Man, the last few weeks, they've not been good if you've been anticipating the Batman Part 2. All this talk about delays and unfinished scripts and push release windows, and then all this speculation about if this film is even happening. It's been kind of depressing, honestly. But, since we've apparently got plenty of time on our hands, I thought this week I might try and guess at where Matt Reeves might take this sequel when it finally comes out in 2037. Since the Batman came out all the way back in 2022 and the online speculation started about what villain Reeves was going to use in the sequel, I've been hearing people screaming for the Court of Owls. And I just have to ask, why? The Court has been the main big bad in exactly one major comic book story from 14 years ago. And also one game. I like the Court of Owls story well enough. It's one of exactly two good stories to come out of what was in retrospect a pretty mid-run on Batman from Scott Snyder. But really, I don't get people's obsession with the Court of Owls or why they would want to see them over, say, Mr. Freeze or Two-Face. Plus, how would the Court of Owls work in Reeves' universe anyway? Kind of feels like a lot of the bigger moments to come out of the Court of Owls storyline that people refer back to and remember fondly don't have a chance of making it into the Batman Part 2 without being seriously pared down. I don't know about you, but I don't think Bruce Wayne's possible secret brother Thomas Wayne Owlman is making an appearance. The same goes for the Talons being basically 100-year-old zombie assassins. Yeah, I think we can safely rule those out. Batman going ham on a bunch of Talons who've invaded the Batcave in a mech suit? In this universe? Yeah, I don't think so. And when you pare down or just outright remove a lot of the more fantastical elements that are baked into the mythology of the Court of Owls, all you've really got left is the whole secret society aspect of the court, which is kind of interesting, I guess. Fans of the comic would appreciate it. But I'm not so sure it's so interesting that general audiences would really care all that much for it. So ruling out the Court of Owls, what villains do I think Reeves will use in Part 2? Well, there's the obvious pick of the Joker, who was heavily implied to be putting a plan together with the Riddler at the end of the first film, but I'm not exactly expecting Reeves and co. to take the story in that direction just yet. That feels more like the conclusion to Reeves' trilogy. And honestly, I'm fine with that. I want to see other Batman villains take center stage for a bit. I could also see Reeves pushing Oscorp's Penguin as the main antagonist in the sequel, considering this trilogy of Batman films is called the Batman Epic Crime Saga after all. Who better for Batman to face off against than Gotham's new kingpin of crime? I could see the Penguin playing a bigger part in Part 2, but do I think he'll actually be the main villain? I do not. Now, if I had to guess at the villain for Part 2, I'd say it's this guy, Tommy Elliott, Hush. And what we'll get in Part 2 is a majorly stripped down and retooled adaptation of Jet Loeb's and Tim Sale's Batman Hush storyline. It's not like I'm pulling this idea out of the air either. Hush was pretty heavily referenced in the Batman Part 1. Edward Elliot, Thomas Elliott's dad, was the reporter that was investigating the Waynes and was killed by one of Carmine Falcone's enforcers. The Elliots even got a name drop in the Penguin. Reeves has planted a few seeds, so I think Hush is pretty much a safe bet for the sequel, and Thomas Elliott Hush is an interesting pick as a villain for sure. From what we already know about the Elliott family in this universe, it already sounds like Thomas Elliott and his relationship to Bruce Wayne will be significantly changed from what it is in the comics. One of the really interesting things I've always liked about Tommy Elliott Hush was that he was kind of the total inverse of Bruce Wayne. Tommy Elliott was actually jealous that Bruce Wayne's parents were murdered. That's what Thomas Elliott wanted for himself. He wanted his parents out of the way so he could get his hands on the family fortune. But from what we already know about the Elliots in this universe, Tommy probably won't have a childhood friendship with Bruce, and he'll have the more just motivation of wanting revenge on Bruce Wayne for what Thomas Wayne might have done to his father. I can see Reeves making big changes to Hush. Hope Reeves leaves the visual look of Hush intact, though. This one's a pretty great design from the comics. That's the direction I think Reeves will go in for the sequel. But what I really want to talk about is what direction I'd like to see Reeves go in for the sequel. I want to see Matt Reeves fully embrace the fantastical with the sequel. And what do I mean by that? I want to see costumes, man. I want to see over-the-top gimmicks. I want to see a woman who communicates with plants. I want to see Killer Croc fully realized. I want to see color, man. I want to see Reeves plonk a super-powered villain right into the center of his grounded, realistic Batman universe. And I want to see how the presence of a super-powered criminal changes the game for the Gotham crime families and Batman himself. What I want in the Batman Part 2 is Mr. Freeze. This is what I want to see from Reeves with the sequel, but do I think Reeves will actually deliver this? Well, Reeves has recently gone on the record to address the usage of fantastical Batman villains in his universe, and being honest, I'm a little bit worried about Reeves' views on the subject. What was important to me was to find a way to take these pop icons, these mythical characters that everybody knows, and translate it so that Gotham feels like a place in our world. We might push to the edge of the fantastical, but we would never go into full fantastical. It's meant to feel quite grounded. It doesn't mean that you won't see characters that people love. That's exactly what we want to do. Gentleman Ghost is probably pushed a bit too far for us to be able to find a way to do, but there is a fun way to think about how we would take these characters that might push over into a bit of the fantastical and find a way to make sense of that. You could take Reeves's comments here a few different ways. You could either take it that he means that the more fantastical characters will be made to fit into this more realistic world, so basically having a superpowered baddie from the comics appear in a film, but then stripping them down so they no longer have that fantastical element, like what Nolan did with Bane in The Dark Knight Rises. You could also maybe take it that Reeves is willing to use the more fantastical characters up to a point where them having superpowers isn't so out of place in this world. Personally, I'm taking a more charitable interpretation of Reeves's comments. I don't think Reeves is going to go so far as introducing Man-Bat into this universe, but I could see him giving us a relatively comic book accurate Mr. Freeze. This is what I'm hoping for, but Reeves has even gone so far as to change characters' names to make them sound more realistic, so... You see, the thing is with Batman's villains, and a lot of comic book villains to be fair, these aren't really characters you can tone down and still make work. The attraction of Batman's villains is that they are so over the top. If you start removing or paring down the over-the-top elements of a character like, say, Jervis Tetch, the Mad Hatter, like removing his Alice in Wonderland outfit entirely and then start messing with his mind control gimmick so that it's quote-unquote more realistic, then you lose everything that really makes Jervis Tetch, the Mad Hatter, a draw. Don't get me wrong, you can take the approach of reinventing a villain to make them fit into a more realistic world and have it work. Reeves has already done that, and he did a good job of making the Riddler more grounded while still staying true to the core conceits of the character. But it's easier to take this approach and make it work with characters that aren't really fantastical to begin with. Characters that are street level, non-power characters, there's room to maneuver with those, but characters like Freeze, like Bane and the others, those are the ones you can't really change without breaking. Personally, I don't want to see fantastical characters like, say, Bane made to be more realistic, like what Nolan did in Rises. What I like about Bane is just how over the top he is. That's the attraction. I don't want any of this, "There's a hitman who some people say has ice water flowing through his veins. People call him Mr. Freeze." Bullshit. If you're using Mr. Freeze in your Batman movie, then you need to commit and actually deliver Mr. Freeze. He wears a cryosuit to maintain a below zero temperature and he uses a cryogun that sheets ice. That's the bare minimum anyone should expect with Mr. Freeze. I don't want a totally regular guy who just so happens to call himself Mr. Freeze because he ices people. High Top Films makes a really good case for how you could take a character like Mr. Freeze and make him work in Reeves's universe with a few small tweaks while still staying true to the character. Audiences can accept a lot, and I really don't see anyone's suspension of disbelief being broken just because you have a character like Poison Ivy sitting on the other side of this glass. The major reason I want to see Reeves embrace superpowered villains for the sequel is that it would just be so interesting to see how Reeves would interpret these characters and make them fit into this universe. Embracing the more superpowered characters can only make his stories more interesting, not less. Screw this idea that Reeves's universe is the universe of the more realistic Batman villains, and Gunn's universe is the one where you can have the more fantastical ones. Maybe I want to see what Mr. Freeze looks like in Reeves's universe. Maybe I would actually be more interested in seeing how a fantastical character like Mr. Freeze would work in a universe as grounded as Reeves is. Having said all that, when you take a 10,000-foot view of Reeves's universe, is it in fact so grounded that you couldn't put fantastical characters in here? The thing is that the universe that the Batman takes place in is definitely the most grounded Batman universe for sure. It's a lot more grounded in realism than, say, Nolan's was. But at the same time, I've an easier time believing that characters like Mr. Freeze and Poison Ivy and the Mad Hatter could exist in Reeves's universe than they could in Nolan's. And I honestly don't know why that is. Maybe it's because of the aesthetics of this universe. This universe just reminds me so much of the Gotham from the comics. I feel like you could insert the fully realized interpretations of characters like Poison Ivy, Mad Hatter and Mr. Freeze into the Batman Part 2 and they wouldn't feel out of place. Whereas they would very much feel out of place in Nolan's universe, even though that universe was comparatively less grounded in realism. Reeves takes heavy influence from The Long Halloween, a comic that focuses squarely on the organized crime families. It's basically an war crime thriller, in the same way that the Batman Part 1 and the Penguin HBO Max series were. But when you actually look at how The Long Halloween story incorporates superpowered characters, it's done in a really subtle way, and the inclusion of these fantastical characters doesn't break the overall noir tone of the story or take you out of it. The superpowered villains actually feel like an organic part of that story's world. The crime families, the Falcones and the Maronis, They acknowledge the existence of this different breed of criminal. They don't like them, they think they're freaks, they tolerate them begrudgingly, but they still acknowledge their place within Gotham's underworld in a really believable way. I think this same approach would work for Reeves's Gotham. I could see Reeves's down-to-earth world being turned on its head with the appearance of superpowered criminals, but I don't see it being broken by them. You can have superpowered baddies and also realistic crime families in your movie. They're not mutually exclusive to one another. Considering how focused Reeves was with the Batman on real sets and on-location shooting, this focus on special effects with the sequel and the rumors about Mr. Freeze doing the rounds again, it has me thinking that maybe Reeves does want to lean into the fantastical with Part 2 and try something different, and I'm here for it. You know, maybe going full in on a few Batman spin-offs wouldn't be the worst idea, and considering the absolutely glacial pace between entries in this franchise, I think for now TV might actually be the best place for continuing on the Batman franchise. That's not to say that Warner Bros. Needs to greenlight and fast-track 8 Batman spin-off shows because The Penguin was a hit. The Penguin worked because it was a tightly written, well-paced story. Every show that could conceivably come out of Reeves' universe really needs to maintain that same level of quality. I don't want some Dune Messiah bullshit. Ideally, I'd like to see any new spin-off show expand on some characters that the films won't give top billing to, or some part of Gotham that hasn't been realized yet. I also have this really crazy idea. What about a Batman spin-off show? Now bear with me on this, that actually has Batman in it. Look man, we're waiting 5 years between sequels. Would it really be the worst thing in the world if Pattinson's Batman popped up in a spin-off show? Would it? Really? And I'm not talking about some superficial cameo appearance either. I'm talking about a show that has Pattinson's Batman front and center, actually working a case. It doesn't need to be a massive story either. It can be a pretty low-stakes affair that doesn't have big repercussions on the overall narrative that Reeves is developing across his trilogy of films. A straightforward 4-episode story about Batman investigating a series of murders committed by, say, Victor Saz is fine. Like I said, it doesn't need to be a big story. Or alternatively, Batman could be a meaningful secondary character in a spin-off series too. I'll take it. I just want to see this Batman more than once every half-decade, you know? I've been saying this for years, and that a Batman TV show or limited series would probably be one of the biggest shows in terms of ratings in its given year of release. But year in and year out, we're given shows about everything surrounding Batman. Shows about the city Batman operates in. Shows about his sidekicks. Shows about his butler. Everything but a show that actually has Batman in it. A show focusing on Harvey Dent secretly keeping his DID under control before becoming Two-Face makes a lot of sense to me. Also, a spin-off focusing on Zoe Kravitz's Catwoman pulling off a series of heists also has a lot of potential. Sounds like WB want a second season of The Penguin as well. With the Falcones and the Maronis all but wiped out, there's a good opportunity there to introduce new villains like Black Mask. Keeping with the theme of embracing the more fantastical elements of the Batman books, I'd like to see some writers get creative with some ideas, and maybe TV would be a good place to experiment with introducing superpowered characters. But like I said, if the quality isn't there for some of these projects, then I'd rather Warner Bros. Just didn't bother. Let's talk about Gunn's Batman the Brave and the Bold film for a minute. I'd love to spend the second half of this video speculating on what I think Gunn will do with Batman in the DCU, but honestly, with the lack of updates and just the general confusion around this project, the only speculating I can really do is whether or not I think this film is ever actually going to get made. Batman the Brave and the Bold is so far off from becoming a reality, it honestly feels like a pipe dream. Honestly man, I'm not sure why so many people are getting jazzed about the DCU Batman after that silhouette cameo in Creature Commandos. Not to rain on anyone's parade or anything, but realistically, when do you think you're going to see this Batman in live action exactly? Just putting in perspective, Matt Reeves' Batman sequel has a tentative release date of October 2027, and that's a film with maybe half a script completed. Batman the Brave and the Bold doesn't even have that. In fact, it doesn't even have a writer. So realistically, what's the earliest we could see the Brave and the Bold on cinema screens? No way Warner Bros. Would launch 2 Batman films in the same year, so a 2027 release is out of the question. And there's no chance you're going to be seeing it before then because a script, a cast, and a production start date would already need to be locked in for a potential 2026 release. So what, at the earliest maybe 2028, possibly 2029? 4, maybe 5 years from now? Gee, can't wait. I'm not trying to be negative man, but I'd say if you're legitimately looking forward to the Batman Brave and the Bold, or even these other projects, I'd say maybe you ought to temper your expectations a little bit. Warner Bros. Is not in the same place it was when James Gunn announced that original slate 2 years ago. and it's definitely not in the same place it was 3 years ago when the Batman Part 2 was announced. In the last 2.5 years since, Warner Bros. Has lost big, like majorly at the box office, with their DC properties. The Flash was a massive box office bomb that cost the studio $200 million. It's one of the biggest box office bombs in the studio's history. Aquaman 2 made literally $700 million less at the global box office than the first film, barely making a profit. Shazam 2 Fury of the Gods, bomb. Black Adam, bomb. Blue Beetle, bomb. The Joker 2 Folie à Deux, atomic bomb. What I'm trying to say is that Warner Bros. Might be a little bit hesitant to sign off on and put a lot of these projects into active development, considering the amount of losses they've eaten with the DC brand in the last 2.5 years alone. I think this might be why we probably haven't heard any updates on Batman the Brave and the Bold and these other projects. Kind of sounds like Gunn is quietly walking some of these back. Bottom line, I can't help but think that if Batman the Brave and the Bold was a priority for Warner Bros., bare minimum it would have a scriptwriter attached already, writer's strike notwithstanding. Clayface, a film announced a month ago for some reason, is actually further along in development, as in it actually has a writer attached, than Batman the Brave and the Bold, a film announced almost 2 years ago. And this comment from Andy Muschietti saying the project is delayed? Man, I very much doubt this guy is still directing this film. I'm going to take a shot in the dark here and say that before the end of this year, you're going to find out that Muschietti has walked off this project. Something tells me I don't think we're going to be seeing Batman Brave and the Bold anytime soon. And being honest, knowing Warner Bros.' track record with actually delivering on announced films, I wouldn't be surprised if we never see it. Having 2 Batman franchises running together might have sounded like a good idea a few years ago, but now, maybe not. Maybe Warner Bros. Would rather just have one tentpole Batman franchise running. Warner Bros. Have a lot, and I mean a lot, riding on the success of Superman in July, and I'm guessing that the future for a lot of these projects hinges on that success. If Superman hits big like I'm hoping it will in July, then you might just see some of these projects suddenly getting a big push into production and an updated release schedule to boot. But if Superman doesn't hit big and tanks, well then I won't be surprised to see a lot of these projects just fade away. I'm legit worried about that Supergirl project that's filming right now if Superman doesn't do numbers. I could see Zaslav bringing the axe down on that one even if it's still in production. I wish I could say I was joking, but sadly, I'm not. You might think I'm being overly negative when talking about Gunn's slate and his plans, but man, a lot of this stuff really isn't set in stone, and there really isn't any guarantees when it comes to these projects and Warner Bros.' commitment to them. I'm hoping we'll see Batman the Brave and the Bold, The Authority and Swamp Thing, but these projects are years off and a lot can change in that time. It doesn't exactly bolster my faith in this slate when I'm hearing almost every other week now about a new DC project that's being developed and another being fast-tracked into production. I thought the original plan was that these projects were meant to be the main focus for the next 8 to 10 years. What's Clayface doing on here all of a sudden? And this kind of behavior from Warner Bros. Of announcing seemingly random new films out of nowhere and remaining dead silent on other previously announced films is worryingly familiar. Random projects being announced was something you'd see all the time under Tsujihara and Hamada. Warner Bros. Is the undisputed king of announcing new projects but never actually delivering on any of them, although Lucasfilm under Disney are fast catching up on them. Remember Nightwing from Chris McKay, or the Justice League Dark film from Doug Liman, or the Justice League Dark miniseries from J.J. Abrams? How about Blackhawks, or Ta-Nehisi Coates' Superman film, or Michael B. Jordan's Superman film, or Static Shock, or Gotham City Sirens? Does anyone remember that? The Batman Part 2 is a film I desperately want to see happen, and I think it will happen, but honestly, I wouldn't be surprised to find out that Warner Bros. Have cancelled it either. Again, you might think that's a pretty bleak outlook to have, but really, I can't rule out the possibility either. It legit feels like something Warner Bros. Could and would do. I'm not saying don't get excited for these projects, I'm just saying maybe start getting excited for these projects when you see they've actually started production. And you know what, shit, maybe then you should probably just wait until you can pre-book your ticket at Fandango. Let me know what you guys think. Do you think you're going to see Gunn's Batman anytime soon? Who knows, he might pop up in that Clayface film. They seem like they're really rushing to get that one out for some reason. Anyway, like, share, subscribe and all that. Maybe leave a comment if you feel so inclined. And as always, thanks for watching.